Welcome csc200 to ex11, and I mentioned that I was going to put something in your ex10 folder, but this is actually going to be ex11, so this won't continue ex10. And one thing I just want to point out, I've already logged into my container, and if you don't see your container, because I have this happen every once in a while, if you don't see your container, hit this refresh button, and then if that doesn't work, refresh your browser. Every once in a while I see project here and I don't see my container. So if you ever don't see it, just refresh this and refresh that. Worst case scenario, you could close your container and then just restart it. But I haven't had a problem once I've refreshed. So there's my container. And if you go in here, you're going to see a new folder that I'll put in there. It'll magically appear and it'll be called ex11. And there'll be two files in there. One is display PHP, and that's why I didn't use ex10 again, because we're using a display PHP. Except this time we're also having an index.html, and we're not using index.php because there's no PHP code in our index page. There's just going to be a form, and what we're going to do is we're going to have an input form where we're going to input elements that are going to go into our SpongeBob database, and they're going to display on our display page. Now for this exercise, we're not going to use our database. We're just going to input things into our form, or input records into our form, and then have them show up on the display page. That's all we're going to do, but then in our next exercise, we'll actually put them into the database. But this is kind of like a step-by-step process. So we're going to have index and then display. So we're going to start with index. So I'm going to open this up, and this is our index page. Now, one thing you can do right off the bat is you can go to Project and go to Running URL Import, and just see if you could see your page. And it might say something like this, connection refused. That's because your web server isn't running and it's not showing anything. Even though they're just HTML pages, it's still not running. So we're going to have to go back to here, and you could cancel this. You could keep the page open, but I'm going to cancel this. And then we'll go to our start, and I have my terminal kind of collapsed down there. But what you want to do, I think we could even skip our MySQL and just do the Apache. We'll just do this one, number 2 here. We'll just copy that and paste this here, and we're just going to restart. And that's our web server. And that apparently is also the PHP server as well, and the web server all in one. So I'm going to do that first, and then if I do that, I'll go up here and I'll just refresh it, and there it is. Now I can see my Gorm PHP, and if I go in there, I see that page. And what I'll also do is go after here and just type in ex11, and what it should do, it should show the index.html. So here it is, and that's what it looks like so far. We see this thing that says gender, and it has radio buttons for male, female, and other. Now that's going to be for our database, and there's a submit button too. Now the reason I put this in here is because it's kind of complicated to put in radio buttons in a form, especially if you want to have them on one line. So I just kind of did that for you so that we don't have to spend a half an hour going over radio buttons in a form. There's enough things to do in our form that we don't have to spend a lot of time on radio buttons. So I put that in for you. So keep in mind, that's going to be in there first. All right, when I come back here now that's working. I just want to make sure I see that page, and that's fine. So when I come back here, I could close up this, and I could collapse my terminal, and I have my index.html open, and if you don't have it open, you can open it up. And it's just an HTML page. There's HTML tags, there's a head tag, we have styles here, and there's a bunch of styles. There's form, which are basically a style that's targeting the form tag, the HTML form tag. It's targeting that, and it's giving it a font size, it's giving it a font, it's giving it a margin. So if I go here, that's why it's actually kind of moved over, because the whole form is going to be moved over a little bit. So that's what's doing that. And then there's a label position. We'll talk about that. There's inputs. These are classes, meaning if I give a certain area a class name, then I could kind of target that. Now, normally I could just target input and target the HTML element input and do everything for that. But because I'm doing the radio buttons, I had to do this extra stuff here. So I'll show you what happens there. So I made special classes for the radio buttons and special class for the inputs so that we could align things nicely in our form. That's all that's for, is just aligning things nicely with CSS. So that's just our CSS. So those are in our style tags. And if we get into our body, you'll see that we have basically a headline that says H1 SpongeBob character database, and that's this. This is our H1 right here. Then we have a form that says form action equals display PHP. That means when we process the form or when we submit our form, it's going to go to display.php, and PHP is actually going to process the form. Because if you didn't have another language like that, HTML and CSS won't process a form. You have to use PHP. In the past, they've used Perl and CGI and things like that, but we're going to use PHP, and you could use JavaScript, other things. We're going to actually use JavaScript to validate our form, but we're going to use PHP to process our form because we've been working with PHP so far. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a form. Now, form is an HTML element. Now, if you don't know about forms and you're not familiar with forms, if you go to W3 Schools and go to HTML tutorial, they have a whole area on forms. And I would encourage you to go here and check out forms. Now, you're not going to understand everything, but keep in mind that they'll show you very basic things here. An example of a form. Here's putting in a first name and last name. And let me just show you what this is so far. This is a form where you'd put in your first name and last name, and then you hit submit at the end, and there it's submitted. Now let me refresh this. Now, a couple things just to point out here. Here's the form, so everything in here is in a form. Now, the form's invisible. You don't really see a form. It just is indicating that this area is a form. And it's using this action page, just like we're going to use display page, or display.php, and it has a label. Now, the label, and just to show you what the label is, if I put a capital N here and I hit run, you can see it's putting a capital N here. So that's the label. It says label for fname, and the name of that area is called fname. And if I have a label for it, that's the label. This thing is the label up here. That's why I had an issue with the radio buttons, because the labels are a little complicated to work with. But anyway, that's label 4, and we'll talk about that. So I'll put it back the way it was. Now, there's something here. You can see it says input type equals text, ID equals fname. Now, we're going to use an ID. That'll be for JavaScript, so we won't use it right away, but that's for identifying basically the area. And then name is really going to be, when we use our database, that's going to be our column name. So if we have like first, last, species, gender, that's what that's going to be. So we're going to have name. So that's going to take the input that we put in there. So whatever someone puts in there. Now, this value thing, you might say, well, what's this value thing? We're not going to have a value except for the radio buttons. So you could take out these values in here, and if I run this, you can see there's no values. They're just kind of like a default value to put in there, but you don't need them initially. So we're going to leave these blank, so people are going to put in first, last, species, gender. We'll use a radio button for gender, and so on. So that's what that is. So that's what these things are. So this input type is really this text box. That's input type. The ID is basically IDing the area, and the name is going to be whatever we put in there. So if I put rich in there, that's going to be the name. That's going to be basically the value that's going to get sent to PHP, either to put it in a database or to display it on a page, which is what we're going to do initially. So that's how that works. And again, notice there's an opening form tag, a closing form tag. There's a label for this input text box. There's a label for this input text box, and then there's a type equals submit. That's for the submit button, and we're going to align this, so we're going to use CSS to align all that stuff. But that's what's happening with a form, and there can be checkboxes and text areas and all different kind of things. We're only going to have basically an input text, a submit button, and a radio button. So if you go back here to forms and you start going through here, you'll see there's the form element. There's the input element, which I was just talking about. And here's the 3 we're actually going to work with. Luckily, they're showing 3 here, and that's what we're going to use. We're going to use a text input, we're going to use radio buttons, and we're going to use a submit button, which will basically submit the form to be processed. So we're going to use this text field here, and we're going to use this label for element. And we're actually going to use this input type equals radio. But I have it set up a little bit differently. I didn't use labels for all the radio buttons because we want to have a label just for gender, and then I want all the radio buttons side by side. So that's why I adjusted the code a little bit. So it's not going to look exactly like this. But if you look at this, this is what it normally looks like, and these are the labels. Except I took off the labels. I made gender be the label, and these things I just put in there. So it'll be a little bit different. But in this one, we do need value because whatever somebody checks, the name of this, just like, and it's interesting that it's using gender because we're going to use that for our SpongeBob database, and we're going to use exactly what's here, and this is in our W3 Schools example, but we're going to have name equals gender, but then the value is going to be whatever comes from here. Now we're going to probably have like M, M, F, and O, but the value is what gets submitted and gets put into the database. So that's what's going to be put in there. So radio buttons are a little bit different, and last time I did this, the last spring, I didn't use radio buttons, but I thought it'd be nice to try it since we did use the enum when we created this. So those are radio buttons, and you won't have to do too much for that except style them. And then other things down here, the submit button, we're just going to do submit, and the value is going to be submit, and that's all you're going to have to do. And just keep in mind that there's a form action, and that's going to go to the page that's going to process the form, and it's got to be a PHP page. It can't be an HTML page. It has to be PHP or Python or JavaScript or something like that, but we're going to use PHP. So check out all these things here. There's different form elements. There's a whole list of elements that you can use. There's all kinds of different input types. Here's a whole list. Now we're just using text and radio and submit, but there's all these different things here when it comes to forms. And there's attributes that can go on those forms, but we're just going to do a couple things. Value is well, just check it out. I'm not going to explain all these, but there's different attributes here. So check this stuff out before you do this, or maybe during, or whatever, if you want to take a break and look at some of this stuff. But that's the HTML forms. So hopefully some of that will make some sense when I start talking about forms when I go back to this. So I'm going to go back to this now. Now here's my page. Now there's nothing going on here right now. And here's my HTML. Now what we're going to do in here, like I said, a lot of this is done for you already. Here's the title. It's called ex11, SpongeBob Database. There's some styles here. And then we have some things here for radio buttons. Now we need more than radio buttons. We need something to put in a first name, a last name, and a species. So if you remember, we could go back to here, and they had this input thing. So if you remember how that worked, you could even go here, and if you'd want to copy this, you could even copy this thing. I'm going to copy this whole thing here, and you could type it as well, but I'll copy this out of here. And again, this is for text input fields. I'm going to copy it. I think I copied it. And I'm going to put it before the radio buttons. I have an HTML comment here indicating that this stuff is all for the radio buttons. So I'm going to do this before it. It's going to be in the form, but it's going to be right here. So it's going to say label for, and it's not going to say F name, it's going to say first, because remember, we're going to have first name. And we can put first name here. We can put first name, or we could just put first, whatever you want to have it identified by. That's just going to be a label. So you could have first or first name, doesn't matter. And then what we have here, this is the actual box, the input type box. And I'm going to take away the break here because we're going to have these side by side, and we're going to use CSS to kind of move them around. So I'm going to take away that break. And then I'll tab this over since they're all kind of lined up. And then it's going to be input type text. And ID, we're just going to use the same name for all of these. So it's going to be first, the name is going to be first, and the value, we're not going to have a value, at least for this. So we're not going to have a value for that. That means it's going to be a default value. We're not going to have that. So that's the first one. So if I just want to save this and check it out just to see what I'm doing here, that's what it looks like. Now, they're right on top of each other, so we're going to fix that, but that's okay. That's what we want. And once you did this one, you can copy this whole thing. Now, I'm going to leave this line break here because we're going to put the input boxes on separate lines, but I don't need the label on a separate line. That's why I'm going to keep that there. So I'm going to move that. So I'm going to paste this again, and this one is going to be last, and everything else is going to be last. Now, it's still going to be input type equals text. This is going to be last. ID is going to be last, and name is going to be last. And remember, these should be the names, especially this, should be the name that you're using in your database. So that's why we kept everything lowercase. So we now have first, last, and I'll copy this one more time and paste it. And this one is going to be species, and the heading is going to be species. And I just noticed I didn't change this heading. That should be last. And this should be species, lowercase. And the name should be species, lowercase. And I think that's all we need. We have first, last, species. We have gender. And for all these radio buttons, I have a label that just says gender. So I used label for gender, not for all the individual ones. For the individual buttons, I just put text in between here. So if you're wondering what this is just text in between. There's one that says male, There's one that says female and there's one that says other. And if you're wondering what these things are, these are non-breaking spaces because you can't put more than one space in HTML. So you have to put non-breaking spaces, and these are non-breaking space characters. That ampersand NBSP semicolon is a non-breaking space character. So if you wanted more space, you could put another one. But I basically have two spaces after each thing to kind of separate it from the radio button. So that's this stuff here. That's where the non-breaking spaces are. They're in between so that female, the word female is next to the radio button female. And if you wanted more space, you could put more space in here. You could copy this one more time and put it in there, and then put it here. And then if I save this and I refresh it, that in there, but it also put more space in here. I forgot that I added these, but I put more space in here, so you can see there's more space between these. Now we're gonna make this look nice because it doesn't look nice, so we're gonna do that next. Now we have everything in there for our form. Now one thing I just want to change here, value equals male. I want to make sure that value equals M, and value equals F, and value equals O, because that's what we used in our database. So I'm going to put that in there right now so that when it displays, it'll just use that because that's what we're using in our database. We might as well be consistent. So the name is gender because that's what the field is going to be. The ID is, there's 3 separate IDs because they're a little different. And then the values are different because we're going to get different values based on what they pick. So we have everything here. We basically have 4 choices in our form. Again, we have first, last, species, and gender, and it's a radio button that'll choose one of these, and then we have a submit button. Now, what we're going to do next is make it look a little nicer. So we're going to do a little bit with our CSS, and I think what I'll do is I'll do that in part 2, because I'm not sure how long this video is, but it's probably longer than I think. So in part 2 of the video, I'm going to get the form looking nice, and then we'll get it working.